Ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad to welcome you all. Today we have a very dangerous topic to discuss. Why is it dangerous? Because people have been arguing about this since ancient times. Is it better to mix while arranging, or to mix strictly after the arrangement is finished? As soon as this question comes up in a professional community, whether it's a forum or a chat, you immediately get 4 pages of heated arguments. And if all these people were in the same room together, I think it would come to actual fistfights, because the supporters of both concepts aren't just misunderstanding each other. They're in a state, if not of open war, then a cold war. And let's figure out why I can even say anything on this topic, why I have any sort of opinion at all, even if it's not that important. There's a simple reason. I've been on both sides. I used to be a staunch supporter of the concept of mixing strictly after, and I was also a staunch supporter of the concept of mixing during the arrangement. And honestly, there are certain pros and certain cons to each. Let's probably start with the history. How did the first concept come about? The classic one, which is mixing after. When I say the word classic, it immediately inspires a kind of trust, because it's something old, something time-tested. It's something that works. The old-timers, those who already have a reputation, no offense, they all recommend exactly this concept. And that's it. That's why, for this reason, someone who's just starting out, without even trying the second option, will go all in on mixing after. Because there's this guy, he mixes that way, and I trust him. But don't be too quick to throw shade at mixing during either, because there are actually some huge advantages to it, which I'm about to tell you about. So, the whole concept of mixing after actually came about quite a while ago for one simple reason. There was no way to make music in the box. Now, we do have that option. Especially with electronic genres, they're made 100% in the box. The only thing that comes in from outside the box is the vocals, because vocals are recorded through a microphone and, so to speak, sent into the computer. But if the genre is something acoustic, and you suddenly wake up one morning and see that the calendar says 1961, that means you basically have no way to mix while arranging, because all your instruments are recorded externally and only come to you after the fact. With electronic music, though, that's where some problems start to pop up. I mean, you could say, like, oh, well, if this has worked for 100 years, that's it, I'm done, I don't need any of your fancy newfangled stuff. Here are the dinosaurs, the real masters of sound engineering. And they all mix after the fact. The thing is, acoustic genres, which are all recorded externally and then brought into the computer for mixing, have a very predictable set of instruments that have long been chosen to work well together. And they do work. We can confidently keep in mind that if we have a well-recorded guitar and a well-recorded drum kit, nothing confusing or unclear will happen. Everything will be predictable. We'll just do a bit of mixing and polishing, and everything will turn out fine. But when you're working in genres where you have sampling going on at the same time, with sampling, it's not just that you've pulled out a single chunk, you've sampled a bunch of different pieces. So you've got hocketing, meaning multi-timbral sampling, where one melody is played with different timbres, like what Skrillex does, right? Or maybe you've got some absolutely wild sounds going on, sounds you've crafted yourself, and you are the first person to ever hear it on this planet. No one before you has ever heard it. Yeah, of course, there are probably similar sounds out there, and it's unlikely you'll make something completely new, but it's still a new sound. And here, you can't just confidently say, hey buddy, go ahead and mix after you finish the arrangement, because now we're facing a bit of a puzzle. When we're working in some electronic genre, it's kind of necessary for us to at least occasionally look beyond the horizon, because a lot of you will recognize yourselves here. Remember how you're writing, everything's going well, and then you finally sit down, without even opening the equalizer, just tweak the balances a bit, and boom, suddenly all your timbres sound completely different. The emotions just aren't the same anymore. You just tidied up the balances. Nothing else. Now it's a completely different energy, different emotions, and you're like, wait, this is a totally different arrangement, not what I wrote and developed in those 3 minutes. On the other hand, when we start mixing during the arrangement process, our creative battery drains a bit faster, which is what lets us take a track and push it all the way to some kind of finished state right then and there, to expand it into something 3 or 4 minutes long, for example. So, this also relates to a question a lot of people have. Like, I write a drop, but then I just can't seem to scale it up any further. Yeah, because if you're mixing while you're arranging, your creative battery drains much faster. And that's exactly the problem with mixing as you go, while you're writing and arranging. So we end up caught between these two choices. You have to ask yourself, what's more important to you? If you really struggle with scaling up your arrangement, even just to something like 3 minutes, then the concept of mixing after might suit you better. Usually, that's a common problem for beginners. For hobbyists, for those who write music but aren't professionals yet, it's hard to scale up the structure. In other words, it's easy to fill out the texture vertically, but expanding the form is a real struggle. So in this case, the old classic approach is probably a better fit. This way, you'll save your creative energy, and your brain won't have to keep switching back and forth, switching between the creative mode and the mode where you're just tidying things up. That's more about mixing, really. You go in, clean things up, make everything neat and tidy, and it all looks nice. But with electronic genres, you have to be ready for the fact that once you mix it, it might end up sounding like a completely different track. That's why a lot of people mix as they go, while they're actually writing the song. They're literally composing and mixing at the same time, on the fly. Why is that? Because you need to look ahead. For example, if you have a texture made up of 6 instruments, let's say you wrote it that way, and that's it, you just keep moving forward. But in reality, you might actually have 8 instruments in there. But since you haven't mixed the track yet, it seems to you that there's no space left, that nothing else will fit in. That's the whole problem. And you can't predict this without fixing the balances, cleaning up the muddiness, and resolving conflicts. I'm telling you, you just can't, because this is electronic music, and you're working with completely new timbres that humanity hasn't even heard before. If it's an acoustic genre, everything is clear. We know that this combination, bass guitar, what else can you add? Electric guitar. We can throw in that classic rock organ, the typical one. From the 70s, it'll work. And drums. That's it. This combination always fits together perfectly. But here, we have too many combinations, and we don't know how it's going to work out. That's why people start mixing right when they're writing the arrangement, and the more elaborate or flashy the genre is. Like, say, dubstep, the more likely it is that the producer will be mixing it on the fly. Here's another reason: if you have a lot of tracks, like here, for example, let me scroll through them for you. Well, just imagine, what will happen if you don't mix it while you're working on the arrangement? So, if you're someone who prefers the approach of mixing later, then after getting all these tracks, of course, you'll mix them. Yes, there are approaches where we start with the kick, then all the lead instruments, and leave everything unclear for later. Then we mix all the unclear stuff, put it into some general group, and then bring up the group in the overall balance. I mean, you can figure it out, even if, at most in my career, I mixed 220 tracks. I remember, so it's doable. Your track will end up being very different from what you had in mind when you were writing it. It just won't resemble it in unpredictable ways. It'll be high quality, but as the original arranger, you might be disappointed because it'll have a different vibe, different emotions. And you'll just shrug, like, well, it's kind of logical, but also not really. So, that's why it's like a problem. So, how do you even make a decision? If you struggle with scaling the structure, then you need to pick a concept for yourself. There really aren't many options here. You pick a concept. First do the arrangement, then do the mixing, but not to the point where you don't touch the mixer at all. Get the balances in order. Really get the balances in good shape, not just half-heartedly, but reset all the balances. Often, you'll bring them up from the bottom, because that tends to work better, especially in mono. And each time you adjust them, it gets more dialed in. You might not even need to touch the EQ, and you might not need to touch the compressor either, but your balance should be clean. Even if you're not mixing during the arrangement, you should consider this kind of detailed mixing as something you need to do, because otherwise, things can get completely unpredictable. If you have some issues, not with scaling the arrangement, which usually only happens to professional producers, but if you're not happy with your mix, then you start writing the arrangement and mixing it right away, and not just mixing it aimlessly, but directly referencing other tracks. So you're constantly tuning your ear to the reference, and that's when you'll have more control over your mix. In other words, your vertical control will be better, but be prepared for your creative energy to drain much faster with this approach. Naturally, you might be curious about how I mix. Do I mix after or during? I mix during. When it comes to arranging, if the genre is electronic and it's all in the box, I mix right as I go, and I mix to a reference track. I'm actually a huge advocate for blurring my ears against a reference track. I try not to mix in a vacuum. Of course, I can demonstrate something on YouTube, but I always mix to a reference track. The reason I don't really include mixing with a reference is because the reference is usually a track that YouTube can recognize, and then I'll get ads popping up because of it. That's why. It might seem to many people that I'm just sitting there, randomly tweaking things by ear. No, I do use a reference and compare, because when you're not in some insanely good control room, you're guaranteed to miss the mark. That's where the whole problem of ear fatigue comes from. For example, when I'm at my home studio in Moscow, I have a great control room and great monitors there, so I use references less often. So, let's get back to the concept. If I'm writing an arrangement, an acoustic one, then of course I'll mix it afterwards. There's no other way. If I'm writing it on the fly and I feel like there are going to be a lot of tracks, that it's going to be a complex track, like this one, for example, yeah, but here, of course, the mixing happens during the process. But I've been on the other side too, yeah, when I mixed after the fact. And again, there's a reason for that. That happened during a certain stage of my development, when I still wasn't completely at home with it, not swimming like a fish in water yet. That was 8 years ago. By then, I'd already been making music for about 8 to 10 years, something like that. And I did have a bit of trouble with scaling, of course. It takes a long time to fix that, meaning you need to know a lot of different techniques, how to get out of the loop, that drop, how to develop a verse, chorus, build-up, so you can do it quickly. Back when I couldn't really do that with my eyes closed, so to speak, I naturally realized that this was what helped me out. The method where we do the mixing afterwards. When, during the process, we just endure, we just have to push through the arrangement while our creative battery is still charged. That's all there is to it. Based on this, make a wise and correct decision about how you want to proceed. I hope I managed to break this topic down for you a bit. All the best to you. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Take care.